thanks everybody, and thanks for joining. So, as been covered already, my name is Dr. Susannah Fisher, and I am a Principal Research Fellow in the Department for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. So it's my pleasure to talk you through a fairly short and introductory lecture on how does the world need to adapt to a changing climate. So it's an issue that's been very much in the news recently, so I'm sure you've all got lots of ideas as well. So I look forward to having an active engagement. I think the chat function is not working, but I can see that the Q&A function is. So I look forward to having your responses and kind of continuing this conversation. The nature of a taster lecture is, of course, I will be opening up quite a few ideas, but not many able to answer many of them. So hopefully think of it as a starting conversation, and I look forward to talking about this more. So hopefully, great. Yeah, so what I want to talk about today is 4 main sections of the lecture. So firstly, I'm going to cover very broadly, how is the climate changing? What do we know about the science? And where are we likely to stabilize in terms of emission reductions and global average temperature rises? Then I'm going to go on to talk about what does it mean to adapt to those changes? What are the kind of things that we see happening already? And what else do we need to do? And then thirdly, I'm going to ask the question, are we doing enough? Given the scale of climate impacts that we see in the science and the reality of what we know about adaptation so far from research and practice, are we doing enough to support people, communities, countries, and businesses adapt to the impacts of climate change? And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to study some of those challenges? What are the different perspectives that we can bring on it from different disciplines? What kind of questions might that enable us to ask? And that will then lead us through to thinking about what it might mean to study some of these topics of risk and disaster reduction at UCL. So firstly, I want to talk through how is the climate changing? So what I have up here on the screen are some collages that bring together some of the many impacts of climate change that we're already seeing and we're going to continue to experience. So firstly, the thing we perhaps all think about when we think about climate change is the extreme heat that it's causing, because as the global average temperatures rise, all heat waves are becoming more severe and more long-lasting and more likely to happen because of climate change. And perhaps in this country in particular, we can sometimes think that heat isn't very serious, but actually heat really increases mortality, particularly in vulnerable groups. And it has very severe implications for how people are able to work outside, productivity. So heat, as one of the primary effects of climate change, is something that is already affecting how people live their lives. The other impacts of climate change are often around water, both in terms of how much water we see, when it falls from the sky, when we have rain, and instances where there isn't enough water. So these kind of implications of droughts and floods have implications for how we can grow food, the types of crops that we can grow, what places are safe to live in. And then other impacts such as sea level rise will affect low-lying coastal areas, as we see in the image at the top. And all of these impacts of climate change have other effects on the systems in which we live. So, for example, in the bottom right, we're seeing some examples of nature. So climate change, the change in heat and temperatures, is also affecting ecosystems. Which ecosystems can survive where? Which species can survive where? If we see the fish above, it's affecting where fish are choosing to go in the waters because they need to go to cooler areas. And then if we look in the lower right quadrant, it's also beginning to influence how countries interact with each other. Many transboundary resources, for example, water and river systems that go across 2 different countries, will require us to think about how we can manage those changing resources in climate change in a way that allows people to continue to thrive and work together in a way that's collaborative. So what I'm trying to sum up here with these impacts is that they are many and that they will influence many aspects of how we lead our lives. Now, the global scientific community assesses these in something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reviews all the available science and comes up with an authoritative report, which is used by the world's policymakers to assess where we are on progress. And the latest report on adaptation, impacts, and vulnerability came out in 2022. And that showed that we have a very small and narrow window to act to secure a livable future for all. So the science is very clear that the impacts of climate change are already happening. They're happening in many places around the world, and we have a window of opportunity to turn that around. So one of the things about trying to understand the impacts of climate change is it's of course partly dependent on how quickly the world stops burning fossil fuels and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Now, often in the media, we can have a feeling that this is all heading in the wrong direction, particularly in the current political climate. And what I want to show you is this graph from a United Nations Environment Programme report from 2024, which shows that although emissions are significant, and we can see here the black line is actual emissions on the graph, if we look at the current political commitments, we are expecting to see a decrease and a decline. But the crux is that this is not yet happening fast enough. So we can see from that graph that under the current policies that are in place in countries around the world, that blue line will expect emissions to stabilize. And then we can see the orange line, which is particular policies that governments have submitted to the UN. If those are enacted, we'll see a slightly faster decrease. And then if more money is put behind the system, the red line. But what you can see is to move to the a global average temperature increase of just 2 or 1.5 degrees, which was the world's aspirational target, would require a much faster transition. And that is why many of the world's policymakers are now in Belém in Brazil, trying to speed up this transition so the damage that is done from climate change is less, and therefore the need for adaptation is less. So whilst we are continuing to talk about adaptation in this taster lecture, I think it's important to always remember that this is in the context of the huge need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as fast as we are able to do that, the less we will need to adapt to the impacts. I also just wanted to reflect before we move on to talk about adaptation that we're talking about climate change in a very particular political moment. So as negotiators are right now in Belém, the US has chosen not to attend. At the same time, in the UK, we have some questioning of the climate change consensus by certain parties. So we're also at a time when it's really important to build and support a climate politics that would enable us to make the decisions that the science is provoking us to make. So I now want to move on to the core theme of, okay, if we accept that some of these impacts are already baked into the system, we're already experiencing them in countries around the world, what does it actually mean to adapt to these changes? And what do we mean by adaptation? So adaptation refers to people and communities and countries finding ways to cope with the changing climate so that they can live as they lived before or in a better way than before, whilst managing the changing droughts, floods, heat waves, and other impacts that they are experiencing. And this can be many different things, as we'll go on to talk about. Firstly, I just want to highlight that adaptation, as we've talked about, is one of several policy responses to climate change. And in the first section, we've talked a bit about mitigation. So that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions to prevent any further damage to the planet. So then adaptation, as you'll see in this diagram, again from the United Nations Environment Programme, is then the attempt to reduce the risk that people experience from those damages, to manage disasters that might occur, and help people to cope. But what we're increasingly seeing is even with adaptation, some places will continue to experience risk, or we will not be able to fully adapt in that location. And so there is now a third policy agenda within the UN climate arena called loss and damage. And that is about addressing losses that go beyond adaptation. So for example, after a storm, for example, we've seen some very strong hurricanes recently, the damages there would be considered to be under loss and damage. Or for example, if communities are having to relocate away from a very low-lying coastal area, they are obviously experiencing considerable loss of their place, of their culture, of the lives they had expected to live. And those impacts would be classed under loss and damage. So we're now in the international arena talking about these three policy responses, with adaptation sitting in the middle as a way of seeking to lessen the impacts that people experience. So adaptation really varies around the world, and it varies according to what hazards people experience. So it's often been talked about as a very local thing. In some ways, it's been thought that the reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a global agenda, whereas adaptation is a local agenda based on how people are living their lives locally. And what I have on the screen is several different examples of what adaptation might be in particular places. So one major form of adaptation will be protecting communities along a coastline. So in the top right-hand picture here, we can see there's a flood barrier built to prevent waves coming over in the instance of a storm surge. And you can see that the houses on the other side are built quite low down. So they are at risk from water and from flooding. And the adaptation here is to build a barrier to try and protect those houses and the infrastructure from those impacts. Right in the middle of the bottom screen, you can see an emergency alert. And this is something that's been rolled out in the UK recently, an early warning system coming to all of our mobile phones to alert us in case of an emergency. But early warning systems are an important adaptation around the world. So Bangladesh, for example, has put in place a very comprehensive early warning system around cyclones, where they're able to share international data to understand when the cyclone is coming, share that information with local people and communities in a variety of ways. They have volunteers who go out and engage communities, and then a series of shelters where people can protect themselves. So early warning is a really important part of adapting to the extreme events that we see under climate change. You can also see this nice picture here of a green city in the bottom right-hand corner. And I think one of the things this is showing is that adapting to climate change can also be about appreciating nature and building spaces that are more livable, that are at the same time more able to address climate risk. So, for example, having green spaces in a city allows more shade in the example of extreme heat, but also spaces for rainfall to be absorbed if, for example, that city or that space is prone to flooding. Another example we have here is a large empty leisure centre. And this is supposed to be showing a cooling space. So in the times when we have heat waves, if some people are not able to cool their houses, we need to provide spaces where people can go to get that coolness that they might need. So there's a network of cooling spaces, and in very cold times, there are also networks of warm spaces where people can go if they can't afford or are not able to heat their houses. And in the bottom left, we have the Thames Barrier, which is perhaps an iconic example of protecting London from flood risk. Now, this wasn't built in response to climate change, but it now has a very clever system built in to make sure that the climate predictions are reviewed as the Thames Barrier, its efficacy is reviewed in a process, so that if the climate risks are showing it's necessary, the Thames Barrier can be upgraded as needed, but it won't be done if it's not necessary because of the economic cost of doing so. So all of those examples of adaptation are things that we're doing now. So adaptation is happening already around the world. And what it often does is it enables people to continue to live in the places that they are in the ways they are used to. And in some parts of the research literature, we've thought about some of this as incremental adaptation. So it's doing enough to enable things to continue as usual. And in many places, that is very important and very useful. But what I then want to ask is, are we always doing enough to adapt to climate change? And if, as we discussed in that first section, that the global average temperatures may not stabilize until something like 2.5 degrees, what would it mean to adapt to those kind of impacts? So what we see globally is there is not enough money going into adaptation. Now, when we talk about money for adaptation, it's usually thought of in two different ways. One way is the money that goes through the international system. So this is money that has been agreed to by countries from the global north, the so-called developed countries, to pay to countries in the global south, the so-called developing countries, because they have not caused climate change, but they're experiencing most of the impacts. So this has been agreed within the UN climate agreement for many years, but is always a constant source of discussion, negotiation, and fraught politics. But what we see from a scientific assessment of these finance flows is that even with this commitment, there's nowhere near enough money going to adaptation. So the gap in adaptation finance is thought to be around something like 184 to 300 billion a year. And I think it was in 2023 or 2022, actually, the financial flows going from through the international system like this was around 26 or 28 billion. So we're going to see that there's a massive gap in what's needed. And that's one of the core topics that's being negotiated in Brazil right now. And so that's one of the ways that money flows. Of course, the other way is in countries like the UK, we're allocating our national budget to adapt to climate change. And in those instances, also, we're really not making enough progress. So whilst there are barriers around money, there are also other barriers to adapting at the scale that's needed. And these are things like the incentives to address adaptation. Who owns the agenda within the government? Is it a powerful ministry? Is it one that has power to make these types of decisions? And also the way that the government thinks about its risk and how it manages risk over time, because a lot of the benefits from adaptation will come later on. So for a government making a short-term economic and political decision to choose to do something with long-term benefits is extremely difficult. So due to the lack of finance, but also due to these other reasons, we often see that adaptation isn't really going far enough. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that I referred to earlier, also concluded in their report that most observed adaptation so far has been fairly fragmented and focused more on planning rather than implementation. So we have been able to put some plans in place to say what needs to be done, but actually funding and operationalizing those plans is a real challenge. So I think this leads me to conclude that there are going to be some hard choices ahead on adaptation. So there are going to be situations where the science of adaptation and the escalating impacts mean that we will have to make choices that will question how people live their lives. And there will need to be a political conversation in those places about what they value and what adaptation to climate change means for them. And I have some illustrative pictures here on the slide. So one area where I think this will be very important is relocation and how people move due to climate-related reasons and how the system enables that to do that. Now, that's obviously a hugely controversial issue right now, but it will be something that people may have to face, particularly those in very low-lying coastal areas. They might start to question, when will it be better to move or to relocate this community, and when will the costs be too high? When might this area not even be able to get insurance? So these might be decisions made by individuals, by communities, or as we're sometimes seeing, by governments who no longer wish to keep paying for the infrastructure. I think there will be other hard choices ahead, for example, around food. We know that some crop varieties grow much better in the conditions that we're starting to see because of climate change, but they often might not be the crops that fit within the national or the international system for food transportation and distribution. They also might not be the crops that people are wanting to eat or to produce. So there again, we get clashes of culture, of preference, of how we manage risk, and who has the right to make those decisions and how they're made. So I think that there are a set of questions around adaptation that climate impacts are going to provoke, which is going to require us to come together around some of those issues and think about what does it mean to live well in a particular place in the climate change world that we will be facing. And I think it's important to remember here that success on adaptation will look different to different people because it depends what people value, what they see for their future, what's their future aspiration. It depends also on the time frame that we're talking about. Are we talking about what people would like to do in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20? And of course, adaptation is not happening in a blank slate. It's happening in a world of existing structural inequality, where people have different access to decision-making processes, to power, to resources, and adaptation will exacerbate some of those inequalities. It's also, as we talked about earlier, happening at a real time of changing politics globally. So adaptation perhaps has been seen as a more distant issue and less pressing, was immediate issues such as unemployment, health and education have been more on people's minds. So how can adaptation actually build itself into those local issues and become part of local planning and more inclusionary agenda, and therefore one that meets today's politics? So I think that this taster lecture was billed as talking about what does it mean to transform the systems to think about adaptation, and what does it mean to do transformational adaptation. And so by transformational, I mean here a change in how people are living their lives. So rather than being able to continue in a kind of business as usual modality, it's about having to do something quite different, working towards a different future, having to relocate, having to think about different crops. So it's a bit of a step change away from life as usual. And what I want to show you with this slide is that there is no one way for this to happen. There are a variety of different pathways that people might choose or want to pursue, and it will be down to their values, their understanding of risk, and these other issues that we're looking at onto the slide as to what adapting to climate change looks like for that group in this moment in time. So lastly, I just want to briefly touch on what does it actually mean to study some of these issues that I've raised in the lecture, and what are the types of disciplines that will open up different questions around adaptation. So there are many entry points to the issues that I've talked about, and I've got some of them here on the screen. So one of them is politics. There's a big international politics to adaptation that comes around who should finance it, what the UN negotiations are agreeing, how those ideas are put together, the impacts that they have. But beyond the international politics, there's also, of course, a national and a local politics to adaptation. Who has power to make these decisions at different scales? Whose voices are heard? Whose politics of adaptation wins out in different locations? Another interesting lens would be an anthropological one. How do people actually live with and cope with these risks on a day-to-day basis? You know, what is their experience of how this happens? How are they managing drought already? And how can that be built on with some of these more planned interventions? Increasingly, I think there's a very interesting legal angle to some of these questions as litigation becomes a bigger issue within the climate debate and is used to try and push progress forward, both through governments and businesses. So we have some example already of lawsuits brought around adaptation or about action being not sufficient enough to protect people from climate impacts. So I think there's a whole nother interesting area of study and research there around the legal angles. Adaptation is in a big part about the types of futures that people want to live, but also how we enroll people in thinking about those ideas, and how do we conjure up for people the types of futures that climate impacts might offer, and the way that adaptation can allow us to choose different pathways. So for those types of questions, I think that communications, and Sarah's mentioned here on the call that she's a specialist on risk communication, or also more arts-based disciplines such as theatre, could enable us to open up some of those questions and provide interesting avenues. Of course, there are also the more classic and traditional disciplines that one might think about with adaptation, such as engineering and economics, that would allow you to think about the types of structural decisions that need to be made in infrastructure projects, for example, to manage the climate risk, or the economic trade-offs between short-term and longer-term decisions. So I think that adaptation as an issue to study or an issue to research really offers a huge number of entry points, all of which shed light on a really important and burgeoning issue for the next decades. So I think we'll talk more on this at the end, but I just wanted to highlight that within the department, we have a number of courses that address issues around risk and disaster reduction, including climate impacts. At our undergraduate level, we have the Global Humanitarian Studies. At a master's level, we have these on risk and disaster and resilience. And of course, we also have PhD students. So also feel free as we move into the Q&A section to discuss or ask any questions on those. So that was all that I planned to say. And so now I think we'll open up for questions. And I did a Reddit thread recently, so I've used the ask me anything or ask anyone on this panel anything AMA.
Susannah, really appreciate that. And we have got a couple of questions in the chat, so let me go straight to those. There's a question from Pravat, who starts off by describing a situation in Nepal, where he says, in Nepal, we still face significant challenges due to the lack of an effective early warning system for floods, especially in rural and riverine communities. Could you please share what kinds of initiatives or technologies have been implemented in the UK to minimise flood risks through early warning systems? I've got a couple of thoughts on that, but why don't you have a go first of all, Susannah?
Great, thanks for the question, Prabhat. I have to say that although I've drawn on some examples from the UK, it's not my specialism. So I might suggest, Mark, if you want to kick off, and then I'll add where I
Yeah,
can.
thanks. I thought so. So it's interesting. Whilst there's the UK, arguably by population, has the world's largest concentration of disasters and climate change adaptation researchers in the world. An awful lot of us work mainly in low and middle income countries because, of course, historically, those are the countries that have borne the brunt of the impacts of early stage climate change. Increasingly, though, it is a global experience, and the UK certainly, as we all know, experiences climate change impacts and background impacts as well from existing climate and other hazards. So the importance of thinking about the UK has increased, probably more than the number of people that are focused on the UK, which is quite fun. It means there's a real opportunity to bring lessons from other parts of the world into UK practice. But specifically on this question of early warning, there's a couple of thoughts. One is that actually early warning that's successful is probably not very visible. So to be successful, it would be really embedded in everyday life. It would just be, a source of information that we trust and that we refer to frequently. And that information includes, hang on, there's something dangerous approaching you. And of course, we have that with our everyday weather forecasts and the introduction of the alert system there, which is, I suppose, 3 or 4 years old now. But that's most definitely an innovation in the UK. Now, one challenge of that is, of course, the resolution. So it's kind of county or borough at best, really regional. So to know whether your street, your house is at risk from flooding, or where you live might be exposed to heat, really requires a much higher resolution early warning system. And I think that is still missing from the UK. There's a role there for local governments or to be in charge of early warning, and there's definitely work on that. And there's also an opportunity for us, for citizens to communicate risk, communicate things they might have seen if a river is increasing, or if you're experiencing a high temperature where you live. Perhaps people who live in a similar environment, same sort of house, would also need to be made aware of that risk. So there's definitely a role for new ideas around early warning in the UK. But thanks very much for that question. A couple more questions, Susannah. So one from Jinglu: how can the effectiveness of an adaptation strategy be justified or evaluated?
Okay, well, great question. This is what I actually spend a lot of my day job doing as an academic, is thinking about what the success of adaptation looks like, and how do we evaluate it, and what the implications of that are. So I think evaluating adaptation has had a lot of methodological challenges for some of the reasons that I talked about in this lecture, because you have to think about the time frame over which you want it to be effective, but you also have to think about the outcomes for different groups of people. And you have to consider how risks might transfer onto others as well. And then in that, you also have to think about the changing context. So you obviously want people to adapt to what they're facing now, but also to make sure that it's future resilient for what might happen. And with the changing emissions pathways, we also don't know exactly what that will look like. So for me, effectiveness is very locally based. It's about thinking, what did people want to achieve for their future lives, and how does the adaptation intervention allow them to achieve that? And then it's very difficult, though, to fit those kind of answers into broader systems. So we'll see many of the multilateral climate funds, for example, or if we think about the way donors try and evaluate adaptation, they are much more interested in the number of people that they've managed to reach, the number of hectares that they've managed to protect. So they're looking at these really big scale indicators. But my experience is that it's really the locally embedded understandings which enable us to understand if something has been effective for a particular set of people at a particular time. And this question is actually particularly interesting, Jinglu, because it's part of the global conversation now as well, because right now in Brazil, they are wanting to define 100 indicators to track progress on adaptation. So there's lots of indicators there, things like climate resilient water supply, protection of cultural heritage sites from climate risks, policies in place to address adaptation. So there are lots of indicators and metrics out there, which enable to give us a snapshot, but I think it's often quite locally based as to how effective it's actually been.
Thanks, Susannah. So another question from Tripti, who asks, what does a transformative adaptation intervention look like for informal settlements?
Great question. And I think here it might be helpful to distinguish between a transformative process and a transformative outcome. So far, my analysis would be that what that might be for a particular informal settlement will be quite specific to that location and to what people are hoping to achieve there. And one of the ways that you can bring that about is through a more transformative planning process that engages those who live in informal settlements. So with many projects or adaptation plans, we often see that the inclusion element can be quite perfunctory. And so it's difficult to actually really allow people, often speaking from very different positions of power within an urban planning context, to bring to the fore what they would really like to achieve. So I think a transformative aspect would be that we see in some examples is a process that allows residents of informal settlements to actually put on the table what they would like to achieve and to work with urban planners on a more equal footing to achieve that. And we've seen some really great examples also of how those living in informal settlements have created data, worked with kind of community mapping to really demonstrate what their risks look like to enable them to then make more transformative investments. But I might also perhaps, Mark, if you'd like to chime in as more of an urban specialist.
Thanks. Yeah, as it happens, I work a lot in informal settlements on adaptation and risk reduction. And for me, though, transformative adaptation is about changing the underlying root causes that lead to risk. And one of the root causes in informal settlements is lack of land tenure. So just to pick on one thing that would be transformative, it would be to grant land tenure and thereby allow local government to provide critical infrastructure, water, drainage, sanitation, and so forth for the residents of so-called informal settlements. Now, that's a very big ask. So that's a big political struggle. And meanwhile, incremental adaptation probably has a big role to play, but that would be my kind of number one transformative adaptation action. And you'll note, of course, that it's got nothing to do with risk management. Providing land tenure is just a fundamental transfer of rights. So thank you for that. We have a few more questions, Susannah, if you're happy to answer these. Another tricky one for you. Islam asks, does climate change bring any opportunities?
Yes, it does. It brings opportunities for some people and places. And I think that's perhaps the great inequity of it. So, I mean, for example, in the UK, and this is an often cited example, but we see more varieties of wine being grown in the south of England as the climate starts to change. So that's an agricultural opportunity for some people. We'd also see, different as the temperatures change, we see the kind of northern latitudes becoming a bit more attractive in some ways, perhaps opening up different opportunities for agriculture there as well. So I think the key thing about climate change is how those opportunities and threats are balanced and how we manage that. Because yes, some places will potentially experience that kind of change, but of course, all within the context of global changes that might destabilize some of the systems that we're used to working within. And so no particular location is entirely safe from changes that go on elsewhere because of, for example, connections through supply chains, through relationships between countries. So while some places will see new agricultural and potentially economic opportunities, they will still, in all likelihood, I think, bear some of the risk that cuts across boundaries and will shape also how they can take on those opportunities.
Thank you. So another question to keep going from Edgy, who asks, are there any relatively small scale local adaptation funds or discussions on how to support community-based organisations, particularly farmer communities and agri-food cooperatives?
Well, there's lots of brilliant work done on how to bring adaptation funds down to communities. And for example, the International Institute of Environment Development, I know, has done quite a big project on what they call, I think it's called Getting Money Where It Matters. And that's about these types of funds that you're talking about that are able to channel funds down to much smaller groups and cooperatives. So yes, I think there's quite an active community working on this. Of course, the bigger funds are also seeking to devolve money down locally. So we see the multilateral climate funds also developing what they call their locally led adaptation windows. But what we also see is just the demands of those types of funds can be really restrictive for community-based organizations to access them. And so I know of a variety of intermediaries, IID, but others as well, who work to kind of to help make that gap. So yeah, in terms of resources, I think IID would have several on how to balance that gap and the kind of work right at the forefront of trying to devolve money down to local community groups. I think it's a really exciting and evolving area, and one that hopefully we'll see a lot of progress in the next decade.
Thanks, Susannah. So we have a question from the Q&A, so we're not sure who's sent it in. Apologies for that, but here it is. Is there a hierarchy in the discourse of climate risk? So certain climate risk topics get more or less attention than others, and if so, why?
Well, it's a great question, and it's good that we also have a risk communication specialist on the line who could also give her thoughts. I guess it depends attention by whom and in what context. So climate risk, obviously, it attaches policy, it receives policy attention, it receives media attention, it receives all kinds of attention by local groups and communities and citizens. So I mean, great, I'm glad you've come on, Sarah. My impression would be that something like an extreme event, by which I mean something like the hurricane that's unfortunately just been experienced in Jamaica, acts as a bit of a focusing event, often for the media and for politicians. And we've often seen those types of extreme events then impact onto international political discussions because they make the issues so relevant. So my assessment would be that those types of events do receive a lot of attention at the time, but that can then dissipate. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think extreme heat has not received so much attention, and particularly in countries perhaps like the UK, which haven't traditionally thought of themselves as experiencing much heat, and something like flooding, which has much more tangible effects that last many months after the event, can leave a more of a kind of tangible feeling for communities who are experiencing them. But Sarah, I'd love to get your reflections as someone who works more on these issues.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Susannah. Actually, you've hit on two major points there. One of which is this idea of media amplification. So we call it in psychology the social amplification of risk, which is in part about how narratives play out in communities, which can amplify or attenuate the focus on particular risks or climate narratives, say, but also, as you said, the role of the media as well, which can drive attention towards certain issues and not others. The other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind is, obviously, climate change is something that is competing for the attention of people against the backdrop of many other things that are going on, just day-to-day things that, as you mentioned, might be more tangible to people. but also other kinds of risks. So there's an interesting theory in psychology called the finite pool of worry, which is this idea that we can only hold so much worry in mind at once. So if another risk comes into the fore, if you like, and this happened during COVID, I was collecting some data on this. What we saw was that in the UK, at least, you got this spike in worry about COVID. And at the same time, you got a compensatory decrease in concerns about other issues, including climate change, immigration, and so on. So yeah, there tends to be only so much kind of worry that people can hold, which can shift the direction of the narrative depending on what else is going on in the world. So just a couple of thoughts anyway.
Thanks, Sarah and Susannah. Another question, this time from Valentina, which is really about sustainable development and ecological consequences, benefits of adaptation. But let me read through it. There's a couple of thoughts within it. So Valentina says, adaptation and mitigation infrastructure oftentimes imply major interventions on ecosystems. Are there any methodologies to evaluate if resilience is gained as a socio-ecological system in the whole, or if it only benefits human communities? And then also, we have, especially in the global south, lots of old infrastructure that was never taken down. For example, older dams, sometimes more than 100 years old. And their management produces socio-ecological conflicts. Some are even forgotten. How can we plan infrastructure that is sustainable in its management and safe for future generations? But the essence, I think, because there's an awful lot there, would be, Susannah, if you've got reflections on the ecological or environmental costs and benefits of adaptation.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Valentina. I think that the ecosystem benefits of adaptation have often been conceived of separately, partly because of the disciplinary communities working on it. And obviously, there's a very active conversation on biodiversity now within the international community and with its own associated funds that is trying to assess some of this. And I think finally, we're seeing that those communities around biodiversity, but also around adaptation, are starting to have more joined up conversations about what it means to protect nature and to adapt nature in the context of climate change. I think often the kind of metrics and methodologies that are used at the highest level to understand about the ecosystem is to think about restored hectares of land. And I think there's a fair amount of work showing that this is quite difficult to actually really understand what's going on, as you term it, holistically, because restored land can mean very different things to many different people, and what it actually means for land to be restored and all the other implications that we might want not necessarily captured. So I think it's an emerging and important issue. I think there are some methodologies, and I think it's partly about bringing together the biodiversity and nature and conservation community with the adaptation community, with this increasing global recognition that we can't really adapt without also supporting nature, and probably some of our methodologies for evaluation will also have to shift to recognize that complexity.
Thank you. Now, we've still got a few minutes left. There are a couple of questions hanging, one from Sarah, which I might hazard half an answer at before handing over to you, Susannah. So Sarah asks or observes that climate change is unfolding within globalized, complex systems with deep uncertainty about its trajectories and impacts. How do you adapt to the unknown? And is this where creative approaches can come into their own? So my kind of initial thought would be that, in fact, all risk management is having to deal with uncertainty. It's just that we pretend there's some bits of uncertainty that we know about and others that we don't. But I think it's all about uncertainty. What a recognition of increasing uncertainty takes us towards is the necessity to enhance resilience, if you will. So for me, that means the kind of generic capacity of individuals, communities, businesses, countries to adapt and move quickly when a risk comes tangible or even lands as an impact. And so that's in distinction from a hazard specific risk management approach that is, dependent upon a certain sort of hazard, like a flood of a certain magnitude, a 500-year event happening, and you can build a seawall, for example, to a certain height to protect you from that scenario. But as you rightly say, with climate change and all sorts of other global processes unfolding, economic shocks, conflict, biodiversity crisis, and so on, we're having to deal with a multitude of pressures, which takes us, yes, to resilience, but then also a recognition that resilience is based on just good development. It's based on functioning healthcare, education, employment, rule of law, a sustainable environment. And those are things that are being undermined or haven't been invested in contemporary development. So it's a really fundamental question about how development unfolds to enable us to be resilient to these unforeseen things. That would be my thought. Now, we've got 3 new messages that came in whilst I was wittering away. So let me quickly check what those are. I think we're good. Sarah has kindly also flagged us to some of the BSc Masters and other programs, and there's a link there. So thanks, Sarah, for doing that. If you wanted, Susannah, I just had one cheeky question right at the beginning, which was about the Brazil COP and what you think a successful outcome would be for adaptation.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I've been thinking about the Brazil COP and adaptation in terms of 3 outcomes: money, measurement, and momentum. So I think money is the one that we're seeing in the media and is kind of perhaps the most tangible, that there's a real push now, whereas it was actually Baku was the finance COP. This should be the implementation COP, but the finance decisions are still really up in the air because that was slightly fluffed last year. So I think what will look good will be a concrete commitment to adaptation finance, but also I actually think that there's a lot that's come out now of some documents that the presidency has produced, which talk about other ways of bringing in finance that will be more sustainable in this context of the challenging public grant finance context that we're now in. So the presidency have proposed ideas, such as new taxes or levies. And whilst those will, of course, be extremely politically controversial, I think things like that are more likely to put adaptation on a more stable financial footing. So I think, firstly, some kind of commitment to looking at all of those sources of funding whilst still continuing a good commitment to grant finance, for example, for the least developed countries who need it, will be important. Secondly, the measurement aspect. We've talked a bit about this already. They're seeking to define and decide 100 indicators for the global goal on adaptation. I think the important thing there is really that the decision is made and that allows people to carry on rather than so much the detail of what's in that framework, because I think it will act as a way of incentivizing broader change and finance. But I am concerned that the politics of it mean that it might be left hanging. So I think it will just be important that if that agenda continues. And then thirdly, I think it's about the momentum that happens around the outside of the negotiations. There's been quite a lot of chatter now about the COP and how useful is it to have these meetings. And I think it needs to be understood as one part of a bigger picture. And lots of the way that people will experience climate risk are outside the very formal way that the UN is thinking about it. As you've said, a lot of adaptation actually comes down to development, and that is outside the framework of what can be considered in these conversations. So I think the momentum part of it is about how do those adaptation negotiators and officials there in Belém work with others working on trade, or together with small groups of kind of high ambition countries to build momentum on areas that we can move ahead, even if we can't move ahead with a global consensus. And of course, overriding it all, a commitment to stop burning fossil fuels.
Well, that's a good thing to end on, the big message as ever. Thanks very much, Susannah. Thanks for everyone who's joined in through the chat function, and thanks to Sarah for helping facilitate, and Alex as well. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.